Okay,
Yeah.
so as we dive into menopause and perimenopause,
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about what the definitions are and what is the differentiating factor between perimenopause and menopause. Because I feel like for us laymen, or we're like, oh yeah, sweaty, gross,
Right.
nasty. Like it's not super specific. It's sort of like
No,
names
it's
for
very nebulous.
a
Yeah.
shitload of really
Right.
yucky
Well,
symptoms.
definitely. Listen, the laywoman, I always joke. So I think I've done this post like 3 times where I call it the other P word for perimenopause
Yes.
because, and that was born of the fact that my sister, who's 2 years older, so she's 52 and I'm 50, almost 51. And every time she has a complaint about anything for the last decade, I'll be like, well, and she goes, are you going to say it's perimenopause again? I don't want to hear that because in her
It's a
mind,
catch-all.
well, and many women think that perimenopause is the imminent, like minute before menopause, which it's not. So I'm going to start, I always start with the definition of menopause and then work backward. So the
Perfect.
definition of menopause is 1 year with no period. Again, at an age where it's appropriate. If you're, 29 and you have no period for a year, there might be other causes. But let's say you're around 50, 51, because most of us will go through it at 51. So a year with no period is menopause. So when you're done with that year, you're considered postmenopausal or in menopause, we say, right?
Okay.
Anything about 10 years before can be
That blew my mind.
perimenopause, right?
I was
It
like,
can
that's a
start a
really
decade,
long
right?
time.
And now that means if you go through it at 51, okay, that means starting at 41, you can be perimenopausal. But some women go through menopause at 50 or 49. That means that 39 or 40, they can start having perimenopausal symptoms. And the hallmark, I mean, I describe it as if you think of our normal cycle, it's like a nice sine wave, right? It's very symmetric, it's very predictable sine wave of your hormones going up and then coming down and then shedding your lining, and that's your uterus, that's your period. Perimenopause is, like I always joke, it's predictably unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. And instead of your hormones going up and down like a nice sine wave, it'll be like up, down, 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 up, down, 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 down. And then it might be normal for 3 months and then irregular again. And then you miss it and you think you're in menopause and then it comes back. So when patients say to me, could XYZ happen in menopause, in perimenopause? My response is anything could happen in perimenopause when it comes to some symptoms and you're bleeding, because the hallmark is predictably unpredictable, right? Irregularity of your hormones.
Can I ask
And
a question
so,
about the bleeding for a second?
yes,
I know we're going
yeah.
to get to this, but what is on and off bleeding? And like, what is considered not bleeding at all? Like, I mean, sometimes I just have like junky brown stuff. Is that
Yeah.
bleeding?
Well, first of all, it depends. If someone's on the pill or the IUD, it's a little bit different because
Yeah,
then you
I
have
am on the
reasons.
pill. We'll get to that.
Okay, we'll get to that.
So,
So let's assume off the pill. I divide it into 2 parts, right? I tell
okay.
people, okay, if you're off the pill and and I kind of try to talk about this again preemptively when they're in their early 40s. I never want to say, like, oh my God, it might be perimenopause. So, as in a way, like you're getting old and you should freak out. But I say, listen, you're in your 40s. Here's some things that might come up. Anything that is less, I say, I am not worried about, meaning less bleeding, less heavy, less frequent periods, fewer days bleeding. Anything less, I'm not worried as long as you've had your thyroid checked, which you usually check every year if you see your internist, right? Anything more, heavier bleeding, longer bleeding, bleeding in between periods, soaking through pads, bleeding, more days than usual, is probably still nothing. Like another ism I always say is
I
it's
love
likely
that
nothing.
too.
It's likely nothing, but let's check it out. Meaning you have more bleeding. Patients will say this to me. I got really heavy bleeding for 2 or 3 weeks, but don't you think it's just perimenopause? And my response is always, yeah, I think it is probably perimenopause. But we need to make sure there's nothing else going on because we can't prove perimenopause. And we're going to talk about that, I know, but there's no hormone test.
You're like the comforting but honest friend. I,
Good.
I think
Well,
I sort of feel
yeah,
like that's how I am in my real life. My friends will call me and they go, we're calling you because we know you're going to be honest with us, but you're going to be nice at the same time. But I really just need to know.
yeah.
And
Good,
I
right?
feel
But
like we have to have that.
we need that because, like, listen, I always say about women, like, we're sophisticated. We don't want that old paternalistic, like, no, honey, you're going to be fine, period, full stop. We want to be told, you're going to be fine, but we need to do XYZ to make sure, because then if we find ABC, we're going to take care of it because we're finding it early, right?
Yes.
Like, what I keep reminding women, if they'll listen, is
Mm-hmm.
I am never going to promise that things are not going to happen, but I
Yes.
will promise that I will be like a dog with a bone. And if we work together and we find things early, then you'll be okay.
I sort of feel like it's a little bit like that quote or phrase that anything is possible but not probable.
Oh, yeah, I say, well, it's funny. I say to patients a lot, don't ever ask doctors what is possible. Ask us what is
Yes,
probable. Because if you ask us
exactly.
what's possible, we're gonna be like, we're gonna be like that commercial where you're like bleeding, blah, 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 right? It could be any terrible
Well,
things.
being a neurotic person, I have to remind myself of that. It's like, okay, it's
Yeah,
possible, but not probable. It's possible, but
right.
and that's
It's
sort of
possible,
like
right?
your approach, which I
Yeah,
love. Now,
right.
I want to just quickly re-summarize the less and more thing because I think that delineation is super
Mm-hmm.
simple and super
Yep.
helpful. So
Yes.
tell us again what that nugget is. What's
Okay.
the less and
So
what's
with bleeding, anything less, meaning lighter period, less frequent period, fewer days, less
okay?
heavy, anything less. Assuming again that you're otherwise in good health and that you've had your thyroid checked, that's great. Like I have patients who'll say, I'm 45, all of a sudden my period got lighter. Great. I'm not worried.
Okay.
If it's more, heavier than usual, longer than usual, bleeding in between periods, bleeding more days than usual, then it's probably just perimenopause, but we can't prove that. So we have to systematically disprove other things. Like we disprove it's your thyroid dysfunction. We disprove that it's something in the uterine lining that could be causing it. Rarely it is endometrial cancer, which is unlikely, but possible.
Mhm.
Often it's things like a little polyp growing in the uterus or a fibroid growing in the uterus. So we systematically disprove those things because we can
So
through
there's
different
no
tests.
test for perimenopause. That's the
There's
bottom line.
That's the bottom line.
There's
Because
no
remember,
test.
the hallmark of perimenopause is predictably unpredictable because your hormones, it's not really like your thyroid will fluctuate, but not every day or every week. It'll be like over a couple months.
Right.
Your female hormones, your FSH and LH, will really fluctuate potentially day to day, week to week, month to month. And so you might look like you're in perimenopause or in menopause. You might go through 3 months with no bleeding, hot flashes. If I check your blood work, it'll say menopause. 3 months later, you start bleeding and you're ovulating again. So again, you need a year with no period to say menopause.
So if
Otherwise,
I go to the doctor and
mm-hmm,
I'm 47 years old and I'm
mm-hmm,
not on birth control pills and I
mm-hmm,
have all these other symptoms,
mm-hmm,
what, and I do my FSH,
mm-hmm,
I've read that that number of like 25 or more is
mm-hmm,
menopause.
mm-mm.
No.
No.
What
So
is it?
interestingly, the lab result might say menopause, but the truth is that that's not true. Meaning, so if you come in,
Oh,
let's say you're 47 and you describe to me like I missed my period for a couple months, I'm kind of schwitzy and like all the
yeah.
other symptoms that we'll talk about. I would say to you again, here are the things we need to make sure. Let's make sure your thyroid is okay. Is there any other symptoms? If you're having heavy bleeding, I'm going to send you for an ultrasound. Once we've disproven those things, then we default back to, hey, you're in perimenopause. If you want, I'll do your blood work. But depending on the week and the month, your FSH might be normal or it might be high, and your estrogen might be normal or it might be low. So it can
Mm.
help rule out actual menopause, I would say, right? Like, let's say you're a 28-year-old and we're worried about menopause because you missed your period for a couple months, then FSH and estradiol are really valuable. But in that
Interesting.
perimenopausal time, and again, we're going to talk about other ways
Yeah.
other practitioners check it, it's only confirming to us what we already know based on your age and your symptoms. So I often will just add it if patients want it, but I'm very specific and I say to them, I'm adding it if you want it, but I am telling you right now that there's nothing it's going to say to me that's going to help change what I tell you, which is if you have symptoms, I will help you fix those symptoms. If
So
you
you would you have
only
to have the high FSH and have all these symptoms and have no bleeding for a whole year to be
Mhm.
menopausal?
Exactly. So let's
Okay.
say let's give you a concrete example that happens not infrequently. You're
Okay.
50 years old. You're much more likely to be close to menopause, right? You're 50 years old. You come to me for your annual next week and you say, Shiva, I have not had my period for 8 months. I'm in menopause, right? And my response is 4 more months. And then I'll say you're in menopause. Until then, it's to be determined, right? So you're 8 months from your last period. You're 50 years old. Yes, you might be in menopause, but I will only call you perimenopausal so far. 4 months from now, once we get to a year with no period, then I'll confirm that you're in menopause, right? If I
Okay.
check your hormones that day, there's that chance that they're going to look menopausal. And then a month or two later, you get your period because you've ovulated one more time, right?
Wow. Okay.
So, and that happens all the time. And I have to say, I even hear other physicians and gynecologists misconstruing it. I have physicians and gynecologists who will say to patients, oh, you're 50 years old, you haven't had your period in 8 months. Yeah, you're not going to get pregnant. And that's not true. It's really unlikely you'd get pregnant. It's unlikely if you get pregnant that it will be a viable pregnancy, but it's not impossible. And so you
Mm-hmm.
really have to be clear with women that they need, again, a year with no period. And sometimes when they're on the pill or with the
But with
IUD.
this no period thing, like I said, what if it's like a drop of brown schmutz? Like, is
Okay,
it
so if it's,
literally nothing? Is it like a
it depends.
drought?
Yeah, it
Okay.
depends. I mean, listen, if you said
I'm
I've
trying to
had
not be literal, but I sort of
no,
have
no,
to be
no. It's very
literal.
important. Okay, because I see these things every day in my office, these examples. So let's say more importantly, let's say I've had a postmenopausal woman. She's legitimately 51 with 1 year, no period,
Okay.
no bleeding, right? And she says, then after a year, I had like 2 days of brown schmutz.
Yeah, because I have friends who tell me that, and I'm like,
Yes.
I don't know.
Well, and this is what I would say to them. The likelihood is that brown schmutz, which represents the smallest amount of bleeding that came out of your uterine lining, probably it wasn't enough volume to come out as bright red. So it sat in the uterine lining or it sat in the vagina and it got digested. And then it gets that nasty, like brown, sticky, tacky discharge, right?
Yes.
Probably that was because of menopause. Your estrogen levels were low. The uterine lining got so thin that it was atrophic, we call it atrophy of the uterine
Okay.
lining. And probably that's why you bled. So, again, I would say to them, the likelihood is your brown schmutz that was postmenopausal was likely just because of uterine atrophy. The lining was atrophic.
It's just
But
like bird shit.
just like that schmutz, right?
Yes.
But I can't prove it until I've disproved other things. So you get a pelvic ultrasound to make sure the lining is in fact thin. Because what if that brown is the lining is actually thick? Then you need a quick endometrial biopsy. What if you haven't had a pap smear in a long time and you're just assuming that, it was something else? So you still have to rule those things out.